when I started watching Shampoo, I didn't think I was going to make a video on it because, let's face it, it's a movie called Shampoo. But by the time I finished watching Shampoo, I couldn't wait to make a review because, let's face it, it's a movie called Shampoo, and it's one of the best movies I've seen in months. Not only is Shampoo an extremely funny film, albeit in an understated 1970s way, films from 1975, by the way, but it's also a deeply sophisticated movie with a nuanced view of the culture and politics of a complicated era. And it's also a movie that gives us a sober look at how hard it can be to lead a meaningful life, no matter if you have tons of money or an address book full of women who want to sleep with you. I have neither of these things, but still the movie resonated deeply with me. Now on IMDb, Shampoo is rated 6.4, and I'll talk about why maybe not everybody had the same reaction that I did, why for many people this movie might fall flat, but I'll tell you too why I think it's really pretty great. If you followed the channel at all, you know that I'm a huge fan of 1970s movies. This is peak 70s film. It's directed by Hal Ashby, an iconic 70s director, worked in other decades too, of course, but it stars Warren Beatty, Julie Christie, Goldie Hawn, Lee Grant, Jack Warden, and a young Carrie Fisher 2 years before her career would be completely transformed. That's a great cast. The movie itself is actually set in 1968. I'm not sure if they completely nailed the era, really. To me, it looks a bit more like the 70s, except for the 1968 election constantly on television and some 60s songs at the parties. The clothing, the hairdos, they look a little bit more 70s to me, but I'll leave it to somebody who was actually there to discern. We're talking about a couple of years either way here. The style of the film is not the radical modern style of the late 60s, something like Midnight Cowboy, for instance. It's more of the understated style of the 70s. Of course, there's a lot of overlap. This is hand-wavy. The more movies I watch, really, the more I realize that conventional boundaries between eras don't really reflect the movies that came out in any given year, especially once you start watching more and more obscure movies. Our idea about what the 60s films were and the 70s films, there are a lot of outliers. Possibly more films break those rules than follow them. Even outside of film, many things that people associate with the 60s are actually from the 70s. In some ways, the 60s didn't really hit its peak until 1972. So maybe there isn't so much of a difference at all between 1975, when the movie came out, and 1968, when it is set. Why is it set in the past at all? Well, we'll talk about it. This is really just a very long-winded way of saying that this seems like a 70s movie. You know, I reviewed The Witch Who Came from the Sea on this channel a few months ago, and that seemed to me more like a 60s movie, late 60s movie, but it actually came out a year after this one. So the rules are not set in stone. But when I say that the 70s were a great time for American film, the best time for American film, this is what I mean. That said, there are some aspects of this movie that might not be completely accessible to a modern audience. This film is a comedy, but it's one of those movies that you might not realize is a comedy if somebody didn't point it out ahead of time. I realize this might not be great. It's very understated. If you aren't at least a little bit used to that kind of understated 1970s humor, this movie really might not work for you at all. The movie is mainly, I think, described as satire, and it has satirical moments. I wouldn't call it satire exactly, but this is semantics, so whatever. What's the movie actually about, maybe? Well, Warren Beatty plays a barber in the greater Los Angeles area, and every actress in the movie essentially plays someone that he sleeps with. George, Warren Beatty's character, goes above and beyond with his clients. In the beginning of the film, he seems carefree, not too concerned about manipulating women for his own short-term interests. It's a bit like a juggling act or plate spinning at the circus, where he seems, he tries to keep each of them happy. He tries to keep each of them from finding out about the others. This early of the section of the film, it's sort of borderline slapstick as he tries to keep these different aspects of his life from colliding, and this had some comedic value. It's borderline goofy at times. Obviously, George is not a hugely likable character, and neither are the women that he is sleeping with. Some people might have a hard time with this movie because they don't like the characters. This is another reason why it's rated 6.4, I think. It's fair enough. On the other hand, as the movie goes on, we start to see that none of these characters are really very happy. Now, this is not one of those movies where the main character makes a miraculous 180 and goes from being an asshole to a great guy. This is a sophisticated movie where people really have to grapple with their prospects struggle with habits that have become personalities. All the characters have sincere moments. Now with George, it's difficult at first to know if his sincere moments are genuine or if it's another strategy for getting people to sleep with him. This is a character study about George. We start to see the difference. We start to learn to some extent. We spend a lot of time in this movie wondering just how deluded he really is, though, and it turns out he's very deluded. At the same time, he knows that things aren't really going the right way, that they aren't really sustainable, that they aren't meaningful. Like I said, one of the main ideas of this movie is how hard it is to put together a meaningful life. How many things there are to distract us, how we can end up way out in a desert. And it's not just George who feels this. Although the women in the film are a bit one-dimensional, they are caught in a similar lifestyle trap, I think, where none of the choices immediately before them really seem to change much. Some people might see this movie and think that it's saying that women are gold diggers. That's kind of a superficial reading, in my opinion. I think this film is positioning this sort of convolution of love and luxury culture as a bad thing, something that harms women, not something that they bring to the table that is inherently feminine or anything like that. To be fair, though, it's complicated. And I think the movie actually does justice to the complicated dynamics here. Like I said, the women in the movie are slightly one-dimensional. That's a fair criticism, but I think that we still get a pretty complex perspective on their lives, their alternating impulses of submission and subversion, feeling a need to act out, but also playing along with this system. The schizophrenia of suburbia. Complicated, but I think the movie goes along, does a pretty good job here. I mentioned wealth. Most of the characters in this film are upper middle class. Even if some of them are poor, technically they run in wealthy circles. And there's one very wealthy character, at least. This is Lester, who's portrayed by Jack Warden. Like many of the characters, he spends much of the movie as comedic relief, and he is pretty funny. But he also has similar kind of doubts about leading a meaningful life. These doubts are partly a philosophical thing, right? Partly this is an inherent struggle of being a modern human society and its discontents. But on the other hand, you might suspect that there are social and cultural conditions that make things worse. Maybe economic and political conditions. Maybe these are all intertwined somehow. Partly this is a very personal movie, but it's also a movie about a moment in time, about this cultural, political, economic, social moment. Now, like I've said a number of times, this is a sophisticated movie. It doesn't draw obvious conclusions between social movements or political movements or any other type of movements, really. It doesn't link those to people's happiness or their internal life, really. At least not clearly. This is really, I think, the work of the viewer. That's what you should do when you watch this movie, is think about this. And this is actually maybe one reason why I say that, to me, this didn't strike me exactly as satirical as some other films are, right? Satirical films usually make didactic exaggerations. Things are blown out of proportion in order to prove some kind of point. This is an understated movie. It's kind of doing something different in some ways. There are pointed exaggerations here and there. There are little moments that really ring out, but they don't build to some sort of obvious conclusion. They aren't trying to ferret out some underlying issue in society. At least I don't think so. The film is set in 1968. One of the main backdrops is the 1968 presidential election, which Nixon won. You're just hearing that now. There is a long scene at an election party with the television constantly in the background, and one of the climactic moments of this scene is when Nixon says that one of his goals for his presidency is to bring people together. Like I said, there are moments that ring out. Is this some huge satirical lampooning of the political system? I don't think so, but there are moments that ring out. In 1975, obviously, people would have a very different view of Nixon. Some people take this moment and conclude that the entire movie is kind of about the fakeness of the era or something like that, but I think this is too heavy-handed. But certainly our idea about the emptiness, the seeming emptiness of political participation, that fits in with sort of the difficulty of leading a meaningful life, right? We look we go through society somewhat in this movie, and we look at the various pastimes that people have, the various things they're committed to, and it turns out that none of them quite do the trick. I think this movie is more or less politically neutral. it's definitely worth noting that we don't really see grassroots political activism in this movie. This is really about Beverly Hills, not Berkeley. It's an interesting question of how these two are linked, but if you hear this review and you think, the movie's saying that it's not that the 60s culture wasn't meaningful, even I actually think that's maybe not something I agree with. But keep in mind, this is, like I said, it's not really a movie about grassroots culture. It's more about Beverly Hills, sort of wealthier culture. And those things are connected in some way, but topic for another time. Anyway, we do get an interesting view of different generations. After the election party with senators, businessmen, an older crowd, we go to a party up in the hills where Jefferson Airplane and the Beatles are on the stereo. And a lot of drugs are being consumed, clothing optional sort of affair. And here, amidst a lot of hedonism, a lot of stylish participation in the new world, people seem to maybe have very similar philosophical dilemmas. While a lot of movies focus on the optimism and the positivity of the 1960s, Shampoo kind of takes a different view. Kind of a cynical movie, showing us the unhappiness among the hedonism of a liberated new generation. Maybe suggesting that for all the sound and the fury, we might end up with very little that we're really holding on to at the end of the day. Now, even this had some nuance and some complication. Like I said, we're maybe not looking at grassroots movements to some extent. There's also an interesting question about sort of liberation, particularly sexual liberation in this film. So this movie has a lot of sex in it. And it does a lot of things that would probably have been taboo even just a few years before, especially for a movie with a lot of big stars. I mean, this is a studio film. This is not like some random independent film. It's got a bunch of big actors in it. We are breaking some boundaries here to some extent. And when you break boundaries, there's often some questions that arise about exhibitionism or sensationalism, right? To what extent is this sort of smut? To what extent are people coming to the theaters to see this? So this unhappiness among the hedonism of the liberated new generation is actually maybe something that could describe the movie itself, right? The film is part of this liberated new generation in some ways, given that it's breaking some taboos, that it's showing things that haven't been shown before. Is it meaningful? Well, or is it marketing, right? Is it exploitative? Classic trade-off. So, hard to know. But that's another thing that some people might see in this movie, is that it's a sort of just a sensationalist experience. I think that's not true. This movie is a lot more dynamic than it first seems, really. In some ways, it's kind of a small movie, but I think it opens up and gives us a lot of great characters and a lot of great angles on a complicated time. An understated movie that leaves you with a lot to think about. I'd be curious if any old people are watching this, if it matches with your view of the time. Like I said, it's a little bit interesting, this offset between 1968 and 1975. It's interesting. Some people, I think, will pass Shampoo off as a romp through 60s nightlife. And in some ways it is, but I think that really undersells this, because this is a sophisticated and a discerning film like many movies of the era. And overall, I think I would have to recommend Shampoo as a film that you should check out.